I miss the format of old forums. And the reason I miss it was because I think it lended itself to more thoughtful conversation. And I really strongly feel that the format of old BBS forums was wildly superior to everything that we have now in social media for a couple reasons. First, it's self-selected for a group of people. So the forums that used to exist would usually exist around a topic or a subculture. And so you had the type of personality that would exist in that subculture. The same way that it used to be you'd go to a local gaming shop, and that was the place where you went if you were interested in video games. And it was a different space that you would go if you were interested in tabletop games or collectible card games. And so there was a niche store for every single hobby or place. There'd be a hardware store, and you go there if you were really interested in building stuff for yourself. And that's how the internet originally began, is you'd have a website that was the guy who was really interested in your niche hobby. He set up a website, and there wasn't SEO yet. So people weren't setting up these sites because they knew that being the top search result for this niche hobby meant that they could collect all the affiliate money for it, or that their reviews for the products that they sold would come up first. It was just, there's a guy who's really interested in that, and that's what he was posting about. And then that guy would eventually, because people were contacting him, he'd start a forum. And the people that would go to that forum would be the same people that would exist in the physical space that existed before. But because it's a forum, people would end up talking about other stuff. So every forum that existed had an off-topic space, and the off-topic space was often the best place to hear conversations, right? Because you'd have a bunch of people. It's the same thing that happened in real space. Like if you went to a gaming shop and you started talking to people, like you'd have a conversation about what the best restaurant in town was, because you're all in the space already, and you get to start talking about other things. And actually you posted about this, that eventually online niche communities and forums become about the personalities there. And I was wondering if you could talk about that before I'll get back to the other things about the superiority of internet forums, but I want to get on that topic before I move on.
Yeah, no, definitely. I do feel that way. I also definitely feel like the internet forums are superior. But yeah, what I was posting about was almost exactly what you just described, that when you congregate a group of people about a particular topic, it's funny because I think people that didn't experience it would probably think it's the opposite, that congregating people who are into guitars, that was the example I used actually, would just be a forum where people talk about guitars. But actually it has the total opposite effect, where once you've had all the basic conversations about guitars, what are the best strings, what are the best pedals, I want to sound like Weezer's second album, oh, turn your amp to 6 here and 4 here. Once everyone's had those conversations, you naturally start to talk about other things. It becomes about the personalities there. And then it takes on this meta aspect of being a community of people that all like guitars, but they're actually not there to talk about guitars, which oddly makes some of the most cohesive and interesting online communities, I think.
It's also because niche hobbies attract a certain personality. Like there's a stereotype of someone who plays Magic the Gathering, and there's a stereotype of someone who is really into video games. And there's a stereotype of someone who's always doing home improvement projects. And that type of personality usually has other aspects about how they see the world.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, I experienced that with art too. You know, you meet someone and you say, oh, you're that archetype. You're that guy who makes that kind of paintings in that medium. Like, you're that guy. Nice. You know, so that, I think that carries over to other hobbies and stuff also, for sure.
As an aside, by the way, as someone who does film, one of the challenges I've had in the past is getting actors to play character types that are very different from theater nerds. Because the kind of person who's a theater kid growing up is very different than a character you might want them to play who is from those other subcultures. So like getting someone who's been a theater nerd their whole life to understand the psychology and character of someone, like we mentioned earlier, who's a nerd that lives alone in their basement. That's a character you might want to portray in a film, but it's just so different. And so there's a challenge there in getting someone into that different psychology. But the
well, that's interesting. That's really interesting, man. That's interesting because I feel like, again, it's like kind of an aside, but in art, I don't think I could ever do that. I don't think I could take someone and say, you know, oh, you're this kind of person, but I want you to make this kind of art. That's a really interesting parallel to acting because that's almost inherently an aspect of acting, but of course it ties back into people's personalities.
It's one of the challenges too, I think, around media now is that the type of person who becomes a journalist or becomes a filmmaker or becomes all of these different culture producing nodes is often very different than the audience. And this is something I remember having conversations with people around in film school is that as film students, we were all interested in the weird art. We had seen hundreds of films, and so the films we gravitated to were ones that were different or wild in some way. But the average person is not always watching a film because they want to be challenged in some way or experience something totally new and different. And in fact, if you give them the same thing reliably in some way that feels really good. Like I watched a movie last night. It was very clearly inspired by Guardians of the Galaxy and like big pop sci-fi. And it was really good. But I, as a filmmaker who's seen hundreds of films, kind of knew what to expect and saw where it was going. Whereas if you put an artsier film on or a film that's a little stranger or weirder, I wouldn't know what to expect. And that's an experience that's really fun for me. But for most audiences, they haven't like seen all that weird stuff. And so they kind of want the familiar.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting too in terms of all this because with the internet, who are you catering to? Are you catering to the niche crew or the lowest common denominator or somewhere in between? I definitely experienced that with illustration, and that's part of why I call myself an illustrator as opposed to a painter or a graphic designer or something, because in the term illustration is the connotation that you're if I was being uncharitable, I'd say you're making stuff that like, well, no, it's not uncharitable. You're making stuff that normal people are going to enjoy. If you're an illustrator, illustration is different than, a 10 by 10 foot oil painting of Saturn eating his children. I don't think you really call that an illustration. Illustration has the connotation of Garfield or CD covers or magazine covers or things like that. So that's something I've wrestled with also is subverting people's expectations and how you can do deeper things while also catering to the masses at large and sneaking things under the radar. Because again, on the internet, of course, like we've been saying, you're mostly reaching normal people who are just going about their day and happen to stumble across your stuff. At least that's my situation.
Well, that is a challenge that we were talking about earlier is not knowing your audience online. Because for me, the art that I like and consume is often different than what I know my audience wants. And so there's always that question of like how much to bring that in and just how much to make about me and how much to make about the audience.
Yeah, for me, I have to imagine that I'm catering to quote unquote like normal people, but at the same time, I really refuse to compromise. It's funny you brought up Post Secret. I really want my stuff online to feel like something you found online that is weird and that is from some weird corner of the internet. I refuse to compromise on that. Maybe I take that and wrap it in a blanket that Trojan horses it into the normal world. But yeah, so it's interesting playing that dichotomy.
I feel the same way that I'm always trying to hit both. I want to take this weird stuff that I like and make it accessible to someone who is not familiar with it.
Yeah, I think that's part of the artist aspect that I enjoy a lot. There is I don't know, initiatory sounds a little bit too like highfalutin. I'm not some like dark priest, like baptizing people in a cave or something. But I think there is that aspect of, let me show you something from a different angle. Put it that way. Let me show you something from a different perspective that maybe you hadn't thought of it this way before or, something like that.
I want to circle back to the forum thing because there's a second aspect of forums that I feel like really made them superior. And that was threading. So now, if you're on social media and someone posts something, it's there and gone. Like if you refresh your feed, you will never see it again. Whereas with a forum, there would be a thread and people had to stay on topic on the thread. And so the first post in the thread might be, I read this news article, I saw this thing, what do you guys think about that? And then the whole discussion would be about that thing. And very often there was a debate or topic, but that debate or topic would come in a very focused way and people would quote tweet each other, or not quote tweet, they would quote it and then they would make a long reply. And so you get these threads where you'd have two people who had different perspectives and they would break each other's statements down quote by quote and respond to it. And you'd have these long threads. And there was the advantage that you, as someone reading the thread, could see those two perspectives go off of each other and develop your own perspective on it. And then you could save it and come back to it later. And like, that was the thread on that topic. Whereas on social media, I don't see the same thing happening. I don't see the level of nuanced conversation. And ironically, podcasting is a place where that's kind of happening now. So like you and I are having a long discussion, talking to each other, and other people can listen and have the benefit of that discussion. But that discussion would be very different if we were replying to each other on Twitter or we were replying to each other on Facebook, and people wouldn't have the ability to go back and think about it the way that they would if it was on social media, because they would refresh the page and it's gone forever.
Yeah, and people still link to some of those threads. You know, there are the legendary threads that like someone will link to and you can check it out. Yeah, well, it's interesting. On Twitter, no way. Definitely not. I'll give an example of like one like forum thing I'm thinking of, but on Twitter, definitely not. I mean, it's explicitly not designed for that. There's all these like little messy aspects of it, and of course it compresses what you're saying. But aside from that, which is obvious, I think there's also the presenting yourself as a certain type of person that clouds it. Like we were talking about before with the forum culture, you know, eventually on the guitar forum, let's say, if some interesting topic comes up, here's one that actually happened that I'm actually thinking of right now. I was on this like punk music forum. And like we've been saying, eventually you've had all the conversations about punk music, so it's time to talk about other things. The subject of animal testing came up. And these two people happened to have totally different opinions on it. And I read this whole long exchange between these two people and had my mind opened about all these different topics. But I think it would be different on social media-ized internet if you saw two people having the exchange and one of them, their Twitter bio is, I'm the pro animal testing guy. And the other guy is like, well, I'm the anti-animal testing guy. And then you're kind of walking in like, okay, well, you know, this isn't going to resolve in any meaningful way, obviously. I think also just touching on it, it's an interesting little like internet ethnography thing, but I recently started using Instagram more to post my art. Obviously, it's like, should be my native platform doing art and images. And someone came at me trying to like start an argument. They were like, why'd you draw X thing this way? Like, this looks so dumb. And they were totally wrong. So I wrote a reply and I was like, yeah, you're wrong. Like, you know, about this particular factual thing, here's why. And I got in a little bit of back and forth with them. And I was looking at the Instagram comments where we're exchanging. And I thought, this feels really bad. Like, this format, I feel emasculated cramming my thoughts into these like tiny little Instagram comments. And then I'm imagining people clicking like, show 3 more comments. And I'm like writing these paragraphs down there. And I was like, this makes me feel like a kind of a loser, honestly, you know? And I love arguing on the internet, but it's the format that crams you into this weird, like, emasculated corner of someone's phone. So I think that's probably another just aesthetic aspect of it. On the forums, it feels good. Like you're saying, you can quote someone and it's a big paragraph and then you can see the writing below it. Yeah, I think that's definitely going away. It's sort of a similar thing on Facebook. You know, if you get in a Facebook argument with someone, that already has this like negative connotation. And I think everyone knows that feeling. I haven't used Facebook in probably like 10 years now. But you open it and you see that someone's written like 4 paragraphs and there's part of your brain that says, oh my God, really? You know, you just have like a negative reaction to it off the bat that you wouldn't have on a forum because that's why you're there.
Well, it's also why you're going to the space. So if you go to a forum, like it's literally called a forum from the Roman word for where we would have long discussions with each other. And just like the image of the original Roman forum is a bunch of guys in togas pontificating towards each other. So already you're in a different space. Whereas Instagram, you know, how would you feel if you showed someone a photo that you took and they wrote a paragraph below it? Or if you gave someone your yearbook and they wrote a long comment in it about how you suck. Like already you're not going to that space to do that. And it's similar to physical space. Like if you went to the forum to have a discussion and there was someone waiting there for you who'd responded to something, you'd be like, all right, like let's talk about it. Whereas if you went to the coffee shop to hang out and there was someone waiting at the coffee shop for you and says, you know, the other week you said this and I just was really offended by that. You'd be like, go, just leave me alone. I'm here to get some coffee and hang out. Like, what are you doing? So it's a case where the spaces are not set up for that.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's again funny because one thing about the whole, I guess if you wanted to call it internet studies and be a little bit more formal, is you just keep hitting these paradoxes. The forum and the talking and everything compared to all the other social media platforms is a perfect example of one of those little mini paradoxes, because you would think that moving people over to these platforms where the whole point is that you have a profile that fleshes out who you are as a person would make people's personalities more fleshed out, right? But it's actually the total opposite. I still remember people on forums that were posting stuff because over time you learn more about them. Oh, wow, this guy is actually pro animal testing. Oh, because his mom had this weird disease and it got cured by animal testing. Wow, that's so interesting. But on platforms where, like you're saying, it feels like a yearbook, it feels like a photo collage, there's an interesting paradox there where even though the platform is supposed to let you know more about the people, it almost does the opposite. It like facadizes everyone.
Well, it's because you don't have different spaces to show your personality. So I know that if I'm in a professional setting, there's a certain way that I'm supposed to behave. And in our real life, we frequently talk differently in different spaces. So if you're in bed with someone and you're lying next to each other, you're going to talk differently than you would if you were meeting them in a work environment, right? And if someone comes over to my house, I behave differently than if I meet them at a social gathering. Whereas because the internet is all one space, you're never really sure which space you're in. And so I noticed that on social media, if I post something about or related to the film that I've done or a book that I wrote, that it gets a lot of attention. And when I make offhanded comments about other things that interest me, it doesn't get the same attention. And that if I wanted to talk about those other things, I'd almost have to build a brand around them. Like I would have to go back to zero and think about what content I would post if I wanted to be known for that thing. Whereas people who know me in real life, they know me and I'm interested in multiple things. And if you were to come over to my house, you'd see like books on different topics and different things that I'm interested in, and eventually like get to know other aspects of my life. And so there's a weird way in which you almost need different spaces in order to showcase different aspects of your personality. Whereas if you're on stage all the time, then you're only going to see the stage persona.